Night falls over the Reich, January 1945. The curtain of war was closing inexorably on Germany. January 1945 brought not the promise of blitzkrieg, but the freezing chill of collapse. In the east, the red tide of the Red Army advanced mercilessly. In the west, the Allied offensive, though slow, was an unstoppable industrial mass. And over the skies of the Reich, Allied air superiority was so absolute that Luftwaffe pilots referred to their propeller fighters as flying coffins. The only remaining hope, the only glimpse of a revolution capable of reversing the catastrophic situation, was an aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. This technological miracle had arrived too late and, even worse, had been managed disastrously. The main obstacle was not production or reliability, but the stubbornness of the Führer, Adolf Hitler, who, against all expert advice, had ordered that the Me 262 be developed as a blitz bomber, lightning bomber, instead of an interceptor. This strategic decision, born from the desperate need to attack the invading force, had cost the Luftwaffe a crucial year of development and production. The man who had fought this madness in the high command was the charismatic and decorated General of Fighters, General der Jagdflieger, Generalleutnant Adolf Galland. Galland, one of the youngest aces of the war with 104 victories, was the voice of reason, the leader whom the fighter pilots idolized. He had tested the Me 262 prototype in 1943 and had sent a telegram to Berlin that would become famous. This is not a step forward. It's a leap. His stance was clear and unmovable. The Me 262 should be used only for defense, to hunt the heavy bombers that were demolishing the Reich's infrastructure. However, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, mired in failure, drug addiction and paranoia, refused to yield to the pressure from Galland and his pilots. The tension between them escalated to a legendary confrontation in January 1945, known as the Revenge of the Fighter Pilots' Descent, or the Revolt of the Experts. The fighter aces, fed up with the failed leadership, backed Galland, demanding radical changes. The outcome of this political power struggle was devastating for Galland. Hitler, loyal to Göring and convinced that Galland was part of a conspiracy of defeatists, dismissed him from his post. On January 26, 1945, Adolf Galland, at 32 years old, went from the most important position in German fighter aviation to effectively being a man exiled from his own force. It was an act of purging that, far from solving the Luftwaffe's problems, further demoralized its combatants. Ironically, Galland's dismissal opened an unexpected door. Hitler, perhaps out of respect for his historical reputation or for fear of a scandal among the military elite, offered him an opportunity, a kind of golden exile in action, to create his own jet fighter unit, with complete freedom to recruit the men he wanted, and with the mission of defending the vital points of the Reich. Galland accepted the challenge. He knew the war was lost, but this was his chance to prove the thesis that had cost him his career. The Me 262 was the ultimate interception weapon. Thus was born Jagdverband 44, JV 44, Fighter Unit 44. The name, devoid of traditional designations like the names of past heroes or territorial appellations, was deliberately modest, almost a serial number. However, its purpose was epic, to be an elite squadron of jet interceptors. Galland began a frantic recruitment process, leveraging his vast network of contacts and the immense prestige he still held among frontline pilots. He wanted no one who was not the best. He turned to the Experten, the aces decorated with the Knight's Cross and with hundreds of victories, who had been wounded in combat, burned out by stress, or retired to training or staff positions, often against their will. Heinz Bär, 220 victories, the third most successful ace in the history of the Luftwaffe, a man known for his natural talent and open hostility towards Nazism. When Galland called him, Bär, who had been relegated to an administrative post, accepted immediately. His famous quote summarized the spirit: "The air war is about to end. I want to fly the jet, even if it's just for a couple of weeks." Johannes Steinhoff, 176 victories, another titan, a man of immense calm and leadership. He became Galland's operations officer. Günther Lützow, 110 victories. One of the pioneers of fighter aviation, a friend of Galland, and a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. Walter Krupinski, 197 victories, known as Graf Punsky, famous for his ironic humor and combat prowess. In a matter of weeks, Galland had assembled an unprecedented collection of talent. Aeronautical historian Mike Spick summarized it thus: "Never in the entire history of air warfare have so many high-scoring aces been concentrated in a single unit." This assembly of elites in the death throes of the war did not go unnoticed by the Allies. Allied intelligence quickly became aware of the list of names gathering around Munich. The first provisional base was the Riem airfield, near the city. To the Allies, JV-44 seemed like a piece of absurd and melodramatic theater, the final act of a dying empire. The Allied press and pilots nicknamed it the Galland Circus. The mockery had a double edge. The aircraft's performance, the Me 262, was incredibly fast, but its non-operational rate was extremely high. Often only 6 to 10 jets were ready to fly. The age and status of the pilots. They were retired old glories. The conventional wisdom in Allied aviation held that aces had a limited shelf life. Stress, fear, and the accumulation of injuries sooner or later took their toll. Seeing these men return to the cockpit was viewed by some as a desperate act, a confirmation that the Luftwaffe no longer had young, fresh pilots. The mockery was cemented in the spirit of the approaching Cold War. Allied pilots, on controlled rotations, returned home after a certain number of missions. The German Experten flew until they were killed or captured. JV-44 was the embodiment of that Wagnerian ethic of useless sacrifice. The Allied generals, therefore, did not fear JV-44. They simply considered it a pathetic symptom of defeat, a group of veterans willing to sacrifice their lives for a lost cause. They did not know that this circus would become the deadliest combat unit in terms of kill-to-loss ratio ever seen in the skies over Europe in the final months of the war. The formation of the Jagdverband 44, JV-44, was a whisper in the ears of the disillusioned, an act of defiance cloaked in military compliance. But its operational launch in March 1945 was a deafening roar that sliced through the complacency of the Allied air commanders. The JV-44's chosen weapon, the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, was not just an aircraft. It was a promise of a technological leap, a sleek, swept-wing predator that utterly redefined aerial speed. With a top velocity nearing 540 miles per hour, 870 modernly, it was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest Allied piston engine fighter. The P-51 Mustang, the German Experten, the veteran pilots, knew instinctively how to exploit this colossal advantage. Galland's instruction was simple and final: never engage Allied fighters in a dogfight. The Me 262, while fast, was heavier and less maneuverable than a P-51 at lower altitudes. Its power lay in the high-speed, high-altitude pass. Their tactic became the attack run. The jets would approach the massive Allied bomber formations from above or below, using their sheer speed to dictate the terms of engagement. They would flash through the bomber box, fire a single devastating burst, and then, using the jet thrust, accelerate away before the bomber gunners or their Mustang escorts could effectively track them. The shock on the Allied side was palpable. Bomber pilots who had grown accustomed to fighting propeller-driven fighters suddenly faced an opponent that moved with the speed of a bullet. The Me 262 was often gone before the gunner could even report its presence. As Johannes Steinhoff, JV-44's operations officer described in his memoirs, "The sound of the jet was part of the terror. It was not the roar of a piston engine. It was a high-pitched, terrifying shriek, and by the time you heard it, you were either dead or the danger had already passed you by." What made the Me-262 a nightmare for the lumbering four-engine bombers was not only its speed, but its devastating armament. The Schwalbe carried 4 massive 30mm Mk-108 cannons clustered in its nose. The shells fired by these cannons were far larger and more destructive than the typical 12.7-meter rounds used by Allied fighters. Nicknamed mine-throwers by the German ground crews, these short-barreled weapons fired high-explosive shells designed to inflict maximum damage upon impact. A burst of just 2 to 3 rounds was usually enough to tear a wing or an engine clean off a B-17 Flying Fortress, forcing the bomber down. But the Experten soon learned an even deadlier tool, the R-4M Orkan Hurricane, unguided air-to-air rockets. The Me-262s began mounting a rack of 24 R-4M rockets under their wings. The tactic was to fire these rockets in a concentrated salvo from a distance of about 600 meters, aiming the cluster at the bomber formation. A single hit from an R-4M rocket was guaranteed to destroy a heavy bomber. The first successful combat use of these rockets by the JV-44 turned the skies over the Reich into an execution chamber. The Experten, utilizing these new weapons platforms, were suddenly destroying entire bomber boxes with impunity. Major Heinz Bär, the most successful jet ace of the war, perfected the rocket attack. Bär, a scrappy, pragmatic pilot who had amassed over 200 kills, famously declared, "The jet is the weapon, but the rockets make it a butcher." In one single attack on March 24, 1945, the JV-44 intercepted a massive formation of B-26 Marauders. The jets sliced through the formation, employing their cannons and rockets with surgical precision. The result was a catastrophe for the Allies, confirming the jet's terrifying potential. While the JV-44 was an angel of death in the stratosphere, it was an easy target on the runway. The jet engines, primitive Junkers Jumo 04 turbojets, required a long, slow period to spool up during takeoff and were prone to flameout or explosion if the throttle was moved too quickly. During the critical phases of takeoff and landing, the Me-262 was forced to fly straight and slow at low altitude. This was its Achilles heel. The Allied generals quickly learned that they could not catch the swallow in the air, but they could kill it in its nest. The official doctrine for the USAAF and RAF changed dramatically. Priority 1 target Me-262 airfields. The Allied counter-tactic became known as the airfield loofah. Waves of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts were assigned to circle the known. Me-262 bases, like the crucial Riem airfield near Munich, waiting patiently for the return of the jets. Low on fuel and momentum, this led to catastrophic losses for other Me-262 units. Pilots returning victorious often had their jets shot out from under them just yards from the safety of their hangars. The JV-44 knew they faced certain doom every time they returned from a mission. The mockery of the circus was replaced by a grim determination on the part of the Allied fighter pilots. Kill the Experten before they can land. Galland knew he could not allow the JV-44 to be decapitated on the tarmac. His response was a unique, radical military innovation born purely out of desperation, the creation of the Platzschutzstaffel, Airfield Protection Squadron. This new unit was designed for a single, suicidal purpose: to provide low-altitude air cover for the Me-262s during their vulnerable final approach and landing role. Since the Me-262 was too fast to operate effectively at low speed, the Platzschutzstaffel was equipped with outdated but highly maneuverable Focke-Wulf FW-190D9 piston engine fighters. These Dora fighters were led by another seasoned ace, Oberleutnant Hans Grünberg. The image was absurd, but lethal. The most advanced fighters in the world, the Me-262s, required the protection of obsolete propeller planes, flying in circles below them, fighting for the few crucial minutes it took for the jets to touch down. The Allies continued to mock, calling the propeller guards the bailout patrol, suggesting they were only there to watch the jet pilots parachute to safety. But they soon learned that the FW-190D9s, piloted by veterans and defending their turf, were tenacious and dangerous. The creation of the Platzschutzstaffel confirmed two things for the Allied generals. The JV-44 was deadly enough to warrant this extraordinary and expensive measure, and Galland was serious about fighting the war until the very last drop of fuel. The retired Experten were far from done. They were just beginning to prove their point. The creation of the Platzschutzstaffel, Galland's propeller-driven guard dogs, was a tacit admission by the German command that the Me-262 was fatally vulnerable on the ground. But the Allies, circling above, watching the FW-190Ds scurry about, still saw a pathetic, desperate arrangement. Yet this very measure was a shield for an aerial sword of unimaginable sharpness. Safe, momentarily on the tarmac, the Experten of the JV-44 took to the skies, and it was here, in the cold, thinning air of the stratosphere, that the Allied laughter finally died. March and April of 1945 became the operational zenith of the JV-44. Despite constant fuel shortages, maintenance nightmares, and the sheer impossibility of the war situation, the unit achieved an air-to-air lethality unmatched by any other German formation at that late stage. The kill-to-loss ratio became a statistical anomaly that confirmed Galland's original belief. The jet was invincible when flown by masters. The primary base at Riem, near Munich, was a cauldron of activity, fear, and focus. Mechanics worked around the clock, cannibalizing damaged jets to keep a core group of 6 to 10 Me-262s airborne. Every launch was a calculated risk. Every returning flight was a sprint against the loitering Allied Mustangs. But once those 6, 8, or 10 jets gathered speed and climbed to operational altitude, they became the most terrifying sight in the final phase of the air war. The Experten operated with a cold, almost surgical precision. They flew high-speed interception against the massive American daylight raids, targeting the formations of B-17s and B-24s. The sound of the Me-262, a high-pitched metallic shriek that Allied pilots often compared to tearing cloth, was the first warning. By the time the gunners could react, the cannon shells were already impacting. The four 30mm Mk108 cannons were short-range weapons, demanding the pilot close to within a few hundred meters, a proximity that required the steely nerve that only the most seasoned Experten possessed. The rate of fire was incredible, and the shells were devastating. An official USAF intelligence report noted that the impact of the 30mm shell is roughly equivalent to a small hand grenade exploding inside the airframe. The jets needed only 2 seconds of burst fire to ensure the complete destruction of a 4-engine bomber, Major Heinz Bär, a rough-hewn, fiercely independent pilot who held contempt for the Nazi leadership but loved the thrill of combat, emerged as the most successful jet ace of the entire war. Bär, who had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front, adapted his relentless style to the speed of their Me-262. He famously perfected the use of the R-4M Orkan rockets. Mounting a rack of 24 rockets, Bär would launch his entire salvo into the dense bomber formations, creating a wide, lethal curtain of explosions that Allied escorts could do nothing to stop. His simple, brutal assessment: "I found their Me-262 to be a fighter pilot's dream. It flew like a demon, and it killed like a butcher." In the short life of the JV-44, Bär alone would claim an astonishing 16 victories flying the jet. His tally, added to the kills of Galland, Steinhoff, Krupinski, and others, quickly mounted. Their total score, conservatively estimated at over 100 confirmed Allied kills for just a handful of jets, meant that every JV-44 operational aircraft accounted for at least 10 to 20 enemy aircraft during its few weeks of life, an astronomical ratio that defied the physics of war attrition. The grim, accumulating scoreboard finally extinguished any trace of Allied amusement. The contemptuous label of the circus evaporated, replaced by cold dread. Allied airmen returning from missions that encountered the JV-44 spoke of a terror they had never experienced. One American B-17 gunner, recalling an encounter in April 1945, described the experience. "You'd see this black shark flash past, and you could try to turn the turret, but it was useless. You weren't fighting an airplane. You were fighting a streak of light. Then you'd see the man next to you explode, and the jet was already 3 miles away." Allied air commanders, forced to confront the impossible loss rates, recognized the truth. They were not fighting a failing air force. They were fighting the zenith of German piloting skill, coupled with revolutionary technology. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the USAAF in Europe, prioritized the neutralization of the jet threat. The P-51 Mustang's mission shifted from escort to denial. Mustang pilots were explicitly ordered to avoid dogfights with the Me-262 in the air, and instead to focus entirely on its Achilles heel, the airfields. The Lufa patrols intensified, becoming deadly, continuous vigils. This desperate game of predator and prey on the airfield perimeter took its inevitable toll on the Experten. The constant stress, coupled with the inherent dangers of the Me-262, guaranteed a short life expectancy. The tragedy struck the command structure directly. On April 18, 1945, Johannes Steinhoff, Galland's trusted operations officer and one of the finest minds in the Luftwaffe, was returning to Rheims. Accounts of the incident vary. Some cite low fuel, others an Allied shell hole in the runway, but the outcome was horrific. Steinhoff's Me-262 crashed violently on landing. The jet's primitive fuel ignited instantly, turning the cockpit into a white-hot furnace. Steinhoff was pulled from the wreckage alive, but suffered severe, life-altering burns that left him permanently disfigured. The loss of Steinhoff, though not a combat casualty, shattered the already fragile morale of the command. Just a few days later, on April 24, 1945, another founding member of the circus, Günther Lützow, took off on a mission near Donauwörth. He was one of Galland's closest friends and a staunch critic of Goering. Lützow was never seen again. He was either shot down by an escort fighter or succumbed to mechanical failure, his fate sealed by the chaotic final days of the war. His disappearance underscored the reality. No amount of skill could overcome the system's failure. Yet the mission continued. On April 26, 1945, Galland himself led a flight to intercept American bombers. He was flying a jet adorned with the number 7 and equipped with rockets. During the frantic combat, his plane was heavily damaged, likely by the guns of a P-51 Mustang. Galland bailed out under fire, sustaining a serious knee wound that ended his war. He was quickly captured by American forces as the final collapse ensued. With Galland wounded and captured, command of the remnants of the JV-44 fell to Heinz Bär. Bär, true to his pragmatic nature, knew his duty was no longer to fight, but to survive and prevent the revolutionary aircraft from falling intact into enemy hands. As the American ground forces advanced, the Experten began the final heartbreaking task, destroying the jets they had risked everything to fly. They placed demolition charges in the precious, temperamental jet engines, the Jumo Jo-4s, and watched the technological marvels explode. The JV-44, the circus that Allied generals had initially dismissed with a chuckle, ceased to exist on the 8th of May, 1945. It had burned brightly for less than 3 months. Yet its legacy forced a profound and lasting shift in Allied air doctrine, confirming that even in the final dark hour of defeat, the skill and innovation of the retired German Experten were still capable of unleashing a singular and terrifying torrent of death upon the skies of the Reich. The smoke of the destroyed Me-262s at Rhym and the other makeshift airfields settled over a conquered Germany. The war ended not with a bang, but with the surrender of exhausted men and the confiscation of priceless technology. The Jagdverband 44, JV-44, the elite circus of the Me-262, had vanished, but the men who flew it, the Experten, began the long, quiet struggle of the aftermath. Their experiences, the brief, exhilarating speed of the jet and the crushing certainty of defeat, would shape the global future of aviation. The Allied forces had won the war, but they recognized the treasure in the wreckage. Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe secret technology, immediately began seizing intact Me-262s, along with the German scientists and pilots who knew how to operate them. The jet that had been a source of initial mockery became the most coveted technological prize of the post-war era. A direct blueprint for the next generation of American and Soviet jet fighters. The pilots of the JV-44, the generals who had learned not to mock, now faced their captors. Adolf Galland, the visionary leader, was captured on May 14, 1945. His status as a decorated hero, a charismatic figure, and a staunch military rival, rather than an ideological Nazi, saved him from the worst fates. He was extensively interrogated by the Royal Air Force, who sought to understand the jet's capabilities and the strategic mistakes of the Luftwaffe. Galland, ever the professional, cooperated, sharing insights that influenced post-war fighter design. His post-war life saw him working as a consultant to the Argentine Air Force and later becoming a prominent figure in the post-war German aerospace industry, maintaining his reputation as a legendary pilot and a controversial but always professional military figure. The tragedy of the Major Johannes Steinhoff was one of physical survival matched by profound psychological trauma. Pulled severely burned from his wrecked jet in April 1945, Steinhoff endured years of painful reconstructive surgeries. His face, disfigured by the fiery crash, bore the permanent scars of the jet age's brutal birth. Yet his leadership and strategic mind were too valuable to be lost. Post-war, Steinhoff became a foundational figure in the creation of the new West German Air Force. The Bundeswehr, rising to the position of Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and later serving as the chairman of the NATO Military Committee. His visible scars were a constant, silent reminder of the price paid for German technological ambition. Major Heinz Bär, the most successful jet ace, continued his pragmatic life in the chaos of defeat. Captured and released, Bär returned to civilian life but remained a test pilot and aviator. Unlike Galland and Steinhoff, he avoided political and military re-engagement, preferring the cockpit to the office. Tragically, he died in 1957 in a light aircraft accident, cutting short the life of one of the greatest natural flying talents the war produced, a man who, in a few furious weeks, had established the highest kill count in the world's first jet fighter. The unspoken victory, a legacy of technology and fear. Ultimate victory of the JV-44 was not in changing the course of the war. That was impossible given the strategic deficit, but in its technological and tactical influence. The Allied generals and designers who had once scorned the circus now meticulously studied every rivet and design flaw of the Me-262. The captured jets were immediately flown and studied in America and Britain. The swept-wing design, the internal layout, and the sheer speed of the Schwalbe directly inspired the key fighters of the Cold War, the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15. The jet age, which began with Hitler's disastrous bomber obsession, was perfected by the Allied powers based on the wreckage and blueprints of the German jet. Moreover, the terrifying efficacy of the JV-44's high-speed attacks necessitated a total overhaul of anti-aircraft and escort tactics. The experience of loitering near German airfields to hunt the vulnerable jets became the new standard doctrine for air superiority. Control the enemy's airfields, and you control the skies. The JV-44 was the last brilliant doomed stand of the Experten. They were men who had amassed staggering kill totals under a brutal system of no rotation and constant combat. They were despised by some Allied forces for their relentless killing efficiency, yet respected by others for their sheer skill in impossible circumstances. In the end, the generals had indeed learned not to mock the retired aces. The Galland Circus was the final lethal gasp of a dying empire, and the 100-plus kills they amassed in their brief existence were not just statistics. They were the hard-won price that forced the world to finally transition from the age of the propeller to the speed of the jet. The story of the JV-44 remains a timeless testament to how extreme adversity, combined with revolutionary technology and singular talent, can produce a final, defiant chapter of devastating effectiveness, even as the walls are crumbling around them. The story of the Jagdverband 44 is not just a tale of technological marvel and final defiance. It is a profound cautionary lesson in the catastrophic cost of poor strategic leadership and the immense, often unquantifiable value of human experience in combat. The destruction of the Me 262s in the final days of the war closed the chapter on the Luftwaffe, but it opened a vast, agonizing historical question. What if? The unthinkable scenario, the Me 262, in 1943, the Allied generals who learned not to mock the retired. Experten spent the post-war years calculating the terrifying potential that had been narrowly avoided. The consensus among military historians and aviators is chillingly consistent. Had the Me 262 been deployed correctly as a dedicated high-altitude interceptor in significant numbers in 1943 or early 1944, it could have decisively altered the Battle of the Skies over the Reich. In 1943, the Allied air forces were using the four-engine bomber as their primary strategic weapon, striking deep into German territory. The primary American fighter escort, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the early P-51 models simply did not possess the range or the speed to effectively counter a Schwalbe force. General Galland's initial vision, a defensive Me 262 force of perhaps 300 to 400 jets, would have been capable of decimating the unescorted bomber streams of 1943. The speed difference was so vast that it would have rendered the heavy bomber effectively defenseless. The resulting losses could have been so high as to force the Allies to pause their daylight bombing campaign entirely. The strategic implications are vast. A slower destruction of German industry, delayed production of key resources, and perhaps a significant delay to Operation Overlord. The D-Day landings. The Me 262 arrived, fully ready for mass production 1 year too late, primarily due to Adolf Hitler's stubborn insistence that it be weaponized as a bomber. The Luftwaffe's technological advantage, the last hope for air parity, was squandered by political and amateurish military interference. This act of denial, driven by hubris, cost the German defense its only viable solution against the Allied air war. The lethality of the Experten, an irreplaceable asset yet. Even more critical than the aircraft was the pilot. The experience of the JV-44 confirmed a brutal, undeniable truth of aerial warfare. Experience is the ultimate weapon. The high kill-to-loss ratio achieved by the retired aces was not a fluke. It was the result of years spent flying in combat conditions, translating into split-second judgment, energy management, and pinpoint marksmanship. Pilots like Heinz Bär, Johannes Steinhoff, and Walter Krupinski did not need long training hours on the jet. They adapted their mastery of speed, deflection, and tactics to the new platform almost instantly. The tragic reality for the Luftwaffe was that its entire system was designed to consume its most valuable resource, the expertise. While Allied air forces enforced rotation and rest policies, pulling their aces out of combat after a set number of missions to serve as instructors, German pilots were forced to fly continuously until they were killed, wounded or captured. This meant the Luftwaffe had the deadliest aces in the world, but lacked the experienced corps to train the next generation of pilots. By 1945, the few remaining Experten, the men who formed the JV-44, represented the entire, unreplaceable knowledge base of German fighter aviation. Their survival, their skill, and their desperate last flight proved that a small force of highly experienced, well-equipped veterans could still achieve local air superiority, even against a titan of numerical and industrial might. The final lesson, the story of the Galland Circus, therefore leaves us with a final, poignant lesson that transcends nationality or ideology. The war that began with the dazzling speed of the Blitzkrieg ended with the silent, desperate destruction of the jet fighters. It is a somber reminder to all military commands of the necessity of valuing and cherishing the service of the combat soldier. The JV-44 showed that genius and bravery, even at the helm of the most advanced machine, cannot compensate for the denial of strategic reality or the destruction of its human capital. The Experten were sacrificed not by the enemy, but by their own high command's blindness and hubris when Allied generals finally stopped mocking the retired Experten in the spring of 1945. It was because they realized the circus was not a joke. It was the final devastating manifestation of a genius that, had it been allowed to flourish earlier, might have extended the war by years. They learned, with terrifying clarity, that the true measure of a fighting force is not the number of planes in the sky, but the wisdom, skill, and irreplaceable experience of the men who fly them. The JV-44 jet aces delivered their final crushing lesson, etched into the history of aerial warfare, a legacy of speed, terror, and tragic, wasted potential.